Welcome to this Liberstoria lecture on epidemics and historical view. So in this lecture we're going to be examining the way that epidemics have been conceived of over the past few thousand years of human history. The idea that epidemics are part of nature, something that we have to interact with, deal with, be scared of, that has been around for a long time. However, the more political element of how an epidemic is dealt with, its political aspect, is something much more recent. The idea that you can fight an epidemic, control an epidemic by controlling a population, that is something that is much more recent, and it has to do with something deep in European Enlightenment thinking that subsequently went across the world. So in the first section here we're going to be dealing with, just briefly because there are too many examples to give, the more naturalistic approach to what an epidemic is about.
Those cells are still living, Dr. Mercer, off one another.
There has to be an answer. You heard that all communications are ended outside the continental limits?
Yes, I heard.
That leaves it in our laps. So we keep trying. Where's Courtney?
But he should be here by now.
You two stay on this virus theory until I decide it's exhausted.
Right.
That kicks the bone marrow theory in the head.
This specimen shows a higher white count than when I put it on the slide. Those cells are still living, Dr. Mercer, off one another.
So if we begin with this first text here, which is a book written by scholars collecting aphorisms and other sayings of the life of the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, we see here a very good example of what you could call Eastern, naturalistic, whatever you want to term it, a kind of naturalistic approach towards what disease is. And Buddhism is a great example. Buddha's thought is a great example of seeing epidemic, seeing disease as part of the human experience, not fighting it, not seeing it as an enemy, not seeing it as an invisible enemy to fight a war against. So if we dive right in here, we can see that the Buddha is recalling a story about a man called King Padmaka. So he says, "There once reigned in Benares a just and powerful king named Padmaka. Now a strange epidemic suddenly swept through the city. Those who were stricken turned completely yellow, and even in the sunshine they shivered with cold. The king took pity on his subjects. He tried to find some way to cure them. He consulted the most famous physicians, he distributed medicines, and he himself helped to nurse the sick. But it was all hopeless. The epidemic continued to rage. Padmaka grieved. One day an old doctor came to him and said, 'My lord, I have a remedy that will cure the inhabitants of Benares.' 'And what is it?' asked the king. He answered, 'It is a large fish named Rohita. Have him caught and give a piece, no matter how small, to all who are sick, and the epidemic will disappear.' The king thanked the old physician, and he ordered the fish Rohita to be found in the seas and the rivers, but nowhere could it be found. Again the king was in despair. Sometimes in the morning Or in the evening, he could hear plaintive voices crying outside his palace, "We are suffering, O king, save us." And he himself would weep bitterly. Finally he thought, what good is wealth or royalty? What good is life if I cannot succor those who are racked with pain? He summoned his eldest son and he said to him, "My son, I leave you my fortune and my kingdom." Then he ascended to the terrace of the palace. He offered a perfume and flowers to the god, and he cried, "Gladly do I sacrifice a life that I consider useless. May the sacrifice benefit all those afflicted. May I become the fish Roita and be found in the river that flows through the city." He threw himself from the terrace and immediately reappeared in the river as the fish Roita. So I think this text is a very powerful text, and whatever you make of the truth of the story, what it's really saying is that don't fight nature, don't fight disease, don't fight death. Be ready to give away everything, no matter how powerful you might be, how much you have to look forward to, and instead it's all about building something for others and being willing to give up all for others, right? So that was a very typical naturalistic approach to disease in the ancient world, and plagues, epidemics, diseases, communicable diseases, they were not really seen as something alien to the everyday human experience. It was something that everyone grew up with. It was a very common thing for people to lose their brothers, their sisters, their children to disease, their older people in the villages and the towns to disease. It was not seen as something you could do anything about. Now, the ancient Greeks, have some of the earliest texts dealing with how to deal with these things and doing something about it. So here we start to see something that grows in the European tradition, starting with the ancient Greek texts and then building up towards the later Renaissance and Enlightenment texts that we'll see later on. And what we start to see is much more of a concept of trying to grab the disease, trying to measure and observe what it is doing, even though it is this invisible enemy. You can start to describe what's happening to the patients. Now, there's no one better to start with on this account than Hippocrates and his text, his famous text, Airs, Waters and Places. So here's what he writes. He's talking about what a doctor should be able to do. And remember, Hippocrates is usually called the father of medicine. So he says, from these things he, the doctor, must proceed to investigate everything else. For if one knows all these things well, or at least the greater part of them, he cannot miss knowing when he comes into a strange city, either the diseases peculiar to the place or the particular nature of the common diseases, so that he will not be in doubt as to the treatment of these diseases or commit mistakes, as is likely to be the case, provided one had not previously considered these matters. And in particular, as the season and the year advances, he can tell what epidemic diseases will attack the city, either in summer or in winter, and what each individual will be in danger of experiencing from the change of regimen. For knowing the changes of the seasons, the risings and settings of the stars, how each of them takes place, he will be able to know beforehand what sort of year is going to ensue. So we see here with Hippocrates that he's trying to make sense of what is happening in the city by observation, right? He's saying observe things, check what's happening, look at the way the diseases are happening, and he notes as well that diseases attack different cities in different ways. So he's bearing in mind all these different factors, which you can then start to trace human factors. which we know today as genetic differences, DNA, the way people react to different diseases. But he's already mentioning this. But notice at the end, he's basically saying that it's through astrology, astronomy, the ability to watch the stars and the seasons. This is what, in Hippocrates' view, this is something that can prepare the doctor to understand what's happening with the disease. So obviously that is still very linked with the naturalistic view that the disease is something from heaven, from nature, and therefore there's no way of fighting it. So this next text here, it's not really a direct historical text, it's rather a text that was written in the 1900s, talking about, looking back, it's a historian, Bertrand Puckle. He's writing about the impact of the plague on Europe and in Asia, the great plagues of the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, right? The Black Plague, bubonic plague. And what we see here is that there is a kind of middle ground now. We're starting to shift. We start to see the rise of statistics, of doctors going into, very much like what Hippocrates was saying in the previous text, doctors coming into cities, observing what is happening, dealing with the disease. But at the same time, the level of mortality, the number of people who die is so massive that it's, people see this as a visitation. This is the term that is used, a visitation from God, a visitation from above. This is a sickness that destroys people on a massive scale, and therefore it is something that you cannot fight. And often, of course, in medieval Europe and in other places as well, like medieval Islamic countries, this was seen as the wrath of God, that God had placed these diseases in order to punish sinful behavior, right? So this is what Bertrand Puckle writes in Funeral Customs here, chapter 10. He says, "It is to be hoped that with all that modern science has done towards the better ordering of our sanitary arrangements," remember that he's writing in the 1900s here, early 1900s, "and the scientific treatment of the refuse of the cities, we in this country may never again experience such a devastating scourge as the plague which swept over this land in earlier centuries. Even now in India, China and other countries, the mortality from these awful visitations exceed anything we can imagine in our comparative security. There, despite organized relief, the death roll from plague and its fearsome companion, famine, wiped out in the affected districts hundreds of thousands of human lives, and we cannot pretend to have dealt with the subject of death without consideration of the provisions made in such calamities to dispose of great numbers of bodies mown down like corn under the sickle. Far exceeding all visitations of the kind in Europe stands out the Black Death of the 14th century, that's 1300s, and the Great Plague of the 17th century, 1600s. The Black Death, which appeared in London in 1348, started in China and rapidly spread from country to country, leaving an appalling devastation in its wake. Of the 3 or 4 million who then formed the population of England, more than one half were swept away in its repeated visitations. The Black Death left its mark on all phases of national life for 150 years. While no accurate estimate could ever be expected, the death roll is probably not overestimated as having claimed 20 millions of victims. In attempting to relieve the most urgent necessities of the sick, the great religious institutions, which in the Middle Ages represented sanctuary, shelter, and such medical care as they could offer to the people, were quickly overwhelmed and rendered powerless by the losses which they themselves sustained by infection, when tending to the bodily and spiritual needs of the sick and the dying. Of course, that's something we are hearing about today, many doctors and nurses, the healthcare professionals, they're the frontline healthcare professionals. They're the ones who are having the highest infection rates in this current crisis. So here then Puckle adds an anecdote. He says, "There is an old story which so well illustrates the effects of the terror it caused that is worth recalling. A pilgrim made his way to Baghdad in Iraq and was overtaken on his journey by a grisly figure. 'Who are you?' asked this pilgrim. 'I am the plague,' was the response, 'and I'm going to Baghdad to kill 1,000 people.' On his return journey, the pilgrim overtook the spectre again, and stopping him said, 'Why did you tell me that you were only going to kill 1,000 in Baghdad, whereas I found tens of thousands of your victims in the city?' And the plague replied, 'I spoke truly. I killed only 1,000, and the remainder died from fright.' Dr. Gasquet, speaking of the ravages of the Black Plague, says, 'There was no time for Christian burial. The corpse was hurried to the nearest church, where it was consigned to the tomb with the least attempt at ceremony. Consecrated ground was quickly filled to the overflowing, and it became necessary to dig trenches into which the bodies were placed in hundreds, layer upon layer, with but little earth sprinkled in between till the pit was full to the top.' Ditura at Siena, a contemporary chronicler, says, 'And I, Agnolio Ditura, carried with my own hands my 5 little sons to the pit, and what I did many others did likewise. So great was the labour of burying the dead, little wonder that fear seized the stoutest hearts.' So, as we can see, the idea of epidemic in the ancient and even the medieval world, around the world, not just in ancient Greece or India under in the period of Buddha, but also in Asia, also in Italy, as you saw there in the last example, in England, there was a constant fear of the plague, constant fear of epidemics as being something that is either a judgment or something natural that is beyond comprehension. But even in these early times, we see the beginnings of this more political, more technocratic, more combative approach towards dealing with plague. There's this idea that you can fight the plague, that you can control the plague. And underneath this idea, of course, is the idea that you can control the plague by controlling people. And this is what we see here in this final text from the ancient times, and that is in Plato's Republic, right? And in this passage he's discussing, this is Socrates, Plato's teacher, who's being used as the voice of Plato's ideas in this final text of Plato, the Republic. And he's basically examining the idea of how politics and political groups take part in a city, in the Republic, in the city's political activities. And here this is interesting because he uses the word plague as a way of describing the way people, different groups of people who are undesirable in Plato's opinion, how they gather within a city. So this is what he's saying. That, however, was not. So the dialogue here is between Socrates, who's doing most of the talking, and his interlocutor, another philosopher, who's listening and replying. So this is Socrates here. That, however, was not, as I believe, your question. You rather desired to know what is that disorder which is generated alike in oligarchy and in democracy, and is therefore the ruin of both. So oligarchy is a system in which elites rule, and democracy is the rule by the mob, by the people. Just so, replies the person who's talking with Socrates. So Socrates continues, well, I meant to refer to the class of the idle spendthrifts, of whom the more courageous are the leaders and the more timid the followers. the same whom we were comparing to drones, some stingless and others have stings. Drones here, he's talking, the metaphor is towards bees. You have the worker bees, the drones, some of them have stings, others are stingless. A very just comparison. These two classes are the plagues of every city, says Socrates, in which they are generated, being what phlegm and bile are to the body, and the good physician and lawgiver of the state ought, like the wise bee-master, to keep them at a distance and prevent, if possible, their ever coming in. So you can see, of course, Plato is just messing around with ideas of democracy, oligarchy, how to organize a system, political system. But you can see here already the idea that control of populations, because people are like plagues. Now, of course, this is not a medical conception, it's simply a metaphor, right? But you can see here the beginnings of that control. You know, this is the beginnings of it. Now, if we move forward here, we go towards the late medieval, early modern Enlightenment period. We're going to see several texts that continue this similar metaphor of the plague, the epidemic, as something that has to be controlled, okay? As not the plague itself, the disease itself, but rather the population who are part of the spreading of the plague. And we see then the shift, right? What's sometimes called a paradigm shift between plague, epidemic diseases as something that has to do with individual or collective nature, God, judgment, anything that has to do with something outside, towards what we're going to be seeing in this, towards the end of this lecture, which is that the plague becomes humans themselves as carriers of disease. You know, the epidemic is in itself part of the political, social character of human organization. So we see someone here, the Earl of Shaftesbury, using this almost the same concept as Plato, of mixing the political with the epidemic, the medical. So he says, "It has been the wisdom of some wise nations to let people be fools as much as they pleased, and never punish seriously anything that deserved only to be laughed at, and was after all best cured by that innocent remedy." Okay, so he's talking about how should a governor or a president, king, whatever, how should they react to punishing and controlling the people? So you can see it's purely political concept here. And then here he adds, "There are certain humours in mankind that can't be suppressed. The human mind and body are both naturally subject to commotions, and just as there are strange ferments in the blood which in many bodies lead to an extraordinary discharge, so in reason too there are heterogeneous particles which must be thrown off by fermentation." So we're starting to see here, just as people get very hot and bothered, you get angry, your blood is boiling. Same thing with the political environment. People sometimes get really angry. Let them get angry. This is what Shaftesbury is giving as a good liberal thinker. He's advising the kings and leaders of England. If people start to riot, people start to get angry, let them vent their anger. Just like a body, you let it cool off from the anger. And this is his suggestion. But notice that now the political aspect has been very closely tied to the medical, and we're going to see this. So he adds, if physicians tried to stop these ferments of the body absolutely, or attack the humours, back then the humours was this Greek concept of medicine, and it was still popular back then in the 1700s in around Europe. If the doctor was to attack the humours that reveal themselves in such eruptions, they might, instead of making a cure, risk starting an epidemic plague. And there are equally bad physicians of the body politic, right? So this is something that we see rising in the Enlightenment. The idea of the body politic, which had already been established by Thomas Hobbes a couple hundred years before this text, and we'll I'm sure have a chance to examine that concept in detail in another lecture. But you see that there's already the rise of this concept of the population as a mass, as a multitude, being like the constituent parts of an individual body, right, and dealing with it in the same way, right? And then he adds, I'm referring to the ones who insist on tampering with these mental eruptions and under the plausible pretense of healing this itch of superstition and of saving souls from the contagion of enthusiasm, set all nature in an uproar and turn a few innocent carbuncles into an inflammation and fatal gangrene. So carbuncles are a few little spots, and in the doctor, the metaphor he's using, the doctor gets too enthusiastic, tries to fight the illness with too much effort, and what happens in the end is you end up having a worse disease, right? The disease becomes a plague. So of course, the concept is here politically, if you have people who are upset, let them get to the streets, let them riot, let them protest, and then they will vent off, cool off, and then come back, society come back to normal. So here Shaftesbury talks again, at this time talking about the way that people get upset in crowds and create protests or rebellions. And notice how he's still using the medical epidemic analogy here, still using the language medical concept to discuss this political problem. So he says, there's a good reason to label as a panic every passion that is aroused in a multitude and conveyed from person to person in a crowd by just how they look, i.e. by contact or by sympathy, right? If you've ever been in a crowd which loses its patience, loses its mind, right? You know what he's talking about here. People can just from their very look enrage one another. And thus popular fury can be called a panic. As we have sometimes seen, the people are beside themselves with rage, especially when religion comes into it. When people are in this state, their very looks become infectious, right? The fury flies from the face to face. The disease is no sooner seen than caught. You see, he's adding the medical concept. Onlookers who have witnessed a multitude under the power of this passion, while they themselves were in a better frame of mind, have admitted that they saw in men's faces something more ghastly and terrible than is ever expressed by an individual on the most passionate of occasions. That shows the force of society, of being together with other people, in bad passions as well as in good ones. It shows that any affection is very much stronger when it is social and communicative. Thus, there are many panics in mankind, in addition to the panic that only concerns fear. For example, religion is also a panic, and panic occurs when enthusiasm of any kind is worked up, as often on sad occasions it is. For vapours naturally rise, and especially in bad times, when men's spirits are low, in public calamities, during periods of bad food and unhealthy air, when convulsions happen in nature, storms, earthquakes, or amazing prodigies. At those times the panic is bound to run high and the magistrate has to give way to it. Now notice here, there's an explanation here of why the medical aspect and the political aspect are tied, and that's because in the old science, in the old concept of diseases were actually communicable through moods and the airs, the sense of the airs, the humours, as we saw earlier, this Greek concept. So if you were feeling angry or upset, your humours could actually be communicated to someone else. And you'll probably have heard of this because it's the concept of miasma, unhealthy air. Like the air itself as a miasma could translate negative emotions, negative moods from one person to the other. So you can see still here, even though there is this beginning of this concept of control, human reasoning, human understanding of the disease and control of it, just as there is human understanding of politics, you can see here that there's still this concept of disease, epidemics as being purely something naturalistic, a visitation. What he's suggesting here is how to control that as much as you can. What he says is the alternative to that, the alternative to giving way, and when he says the magistrate, he's talking about the leader. For the leader, Shaftesbury is suggesting that there should be a kind of moderate response. Give way, let people vent their anger, let them have their panic, let them calm down, reduce the illness, the social illness, the political illness. But there's also the alternative, and Shaftesbury says, if, however, the leader applies a serious remedy using military force or civil punishments as a cure, notice again the medical analogy here, this is bound to make things even sadder, increasing the cause of the social illness. Forbidding men's natural fears and trying to overpower them by other fears, what an unnatural procedure that is, right? Acting as a dictator, acting harshly towards people to try and force them to stop being fearful, to stop getting onto the streets, to stop being angry, by using your own anger, by using your own fear. He's saying that this, of course, will only increase the fear in the air, will only increase the anger in the air, right? If you've ever heard that, of course, if you've heard that phrase, there is a lot of anger in the air. This comes back to these older concepts where people literally meant anger is in the air. You know, they meant that literally, not just as a metaphor. If the magistrate, if the leader has any skill, he should have a gentler hand, and instead of using caustics, incisions and amputations, he should use the gentlest of ointments. He should, with a kind of sympathy, enter into people's concerns and take their passions on himself. The influence of Shaftesbury on other thinkers is evident as they began to move away, of course, from this older scientific model of miasma, of the air, you know, the airs and the humours, moving away from that Hippocrates model, the Greek model, to the new science, but they maintain this concept of the people themselves as needing to be controlled. We see this in another liberal thinker, Jeremy Bentham, one of the great liberal thinkers of the English Enlightenment. And you can see here, he's talking about public offences, those offences that can hurt the public in general. So you can see here already the criminalisation, the penalisation, the organisation of a system of control of people, right? So he says here, offences through calamity can be classified according to the nature of the calamities that can befall a man, and the various things that are of use to him. These will be considered in another place. Pestilence may serve as an example. Without intending to create such a calamity, a man may expose an entire neighbourhood to the danger of it by breaking his quarantine. Okay, and there's that magic word, quarantine, that we've gotten used to this past year. But you can see the concept here of a quarantine and of penalising people for breaking quarantine. It's no longer a question of disease is a natural thing. Disease is something that you have to be willing to sacrifice to, if you remember the Buddhist text. And it's no longer a question of even the airs or the moods are what affect disease, which is what we saw in the previous text, Shaftesbury. Instead, now there is a much more medical concept of what disease is, and the people themselves, the individuals, are potential disease carriers. So this process that we just saw between Shaftesbury, Bentham, these are just two examples. There are many examples of German, Italian, French doctors, researchers, thinkers, political thinkers, many others who all contributed to this Enlightenment, European Enlightenment, so 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, thinking and controlling of the population of the multitude. And that was very much the research effort of a very influential French historian of much later times, of the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, Michel Foucault. And his whole work historically, as a historian, was focused on trying to trace the way these ideas of the Enlightenment became also kind of a nightmarish vision of control. So on the one hand, it was this kind of enlightenment of freeing knowledge, learning about the world, understanding, for example, diseases, being able to take the invisible enemy of disease and give it a face, by constantly observing it, monitoring it, controlling the populations, using quarantines as we have just seen with Bentham, technocracy, a system of technocratic control. As this grew, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, as that grows, the other side, the flip side of that coin, the other side of that face is of course, the negative, the dystopian. Not the utopian, the optimistic, the one that controls and improves lives, but also the one that has the negative impact, the one in which people lose control over their lives as individuals. People lose their sense of natural relationships with the world, with earth, with gods, with disease. The very right to die, the very right to be sick becomes robbed from people, and they become increasingly supervised, controlled, less and less free in a way. And that is very much part of what his work was about. So here we're going to examine this in an influential text called The Birth of the Clinic. So he writes, the medical gaze, and here he's talking about this gaze as a way of understanding the way doctors, starting in the 1400s, 1500s, building on what we saw with Hippocrates, with the humours, these ancient Greek ideas of medicine. But as they started to experiment, as they started to understand more about the body, about disease, they built this core of knowledge, this body of knowledge, medicine, medical knowledge. And of course today that body of knowledge has become massive, international, just a gigantic body of knowledge. It's not just medicine, it's surgery techniques, anesthetics, it's epidemiology, it's all these different branches, sub-branches. But remember that this is what Foucault is talking about when he says the medical gaze. He means the way in which everything is seen, every problem is seen within the medical understanding of it, not necessarily through a human or a religious or a natural or even a purely political way. It's more a medical technocratic class and body of knowledge which starts to shape our understanding of disease and our response to disease, especially epidemics. So he writes, the medical gaze circulates within an enclosed space in which it is controlled only by itself in sovereign fashion. So of course you'll be thinking right now about this clash that we're currently seeing regarding sovereign nation states and their responses to this current pandemic, and the international body of medical knowledge and the medical experts who have clashed with those countries. That already was happening back then, that the doctors and technocrats in medical system were beginning to carve out a kind of powerful space in which they could interact with citizens, with subjects, with individuals in all the countries, in various countries, and start to control them, on the basis of the medical information. Now notice that of course Foucault is not saying anything, he's not making any judgment about whether this is good or bad. Right? He's describing the development itself, okay? He's not saying it's bad that medicine improved, that it learned how to fight diseases, that people live much longer, that it has eradicated many diseases. All of those things, of course, very true. But what Foucault is trying to do is trying to give you this kind of concept of the development itself, trying to analyze it, right? Not just making a judgment of it, but understand the dynamic of it. What is behind the development itself? So that development is the rise of this medical technocracy, international medical technocracy. And it does that in a sovereign fashion, as he says. And he says, it distributes to daily experience the knowledge that it has borrowed from afar and of which it has made itself both the point of concentration and the center of diffusion. So it is international in its scope. Not just international, the afar there also talks about history. It gets information and knowledge about diseases from history, from historical experiences, build a knowledge of how a disease behaves as we're seeing right now. Today, people who study knowledge, people who study viruses and epidemiology, they're looking back into historical records, trying to understand how viruses hurt particular people during hundreds of years of statistics, right? In some cases, they are reviving old viruses that are frozen in parts of the world to try and study them. So this is the point. There is no limit to the level of knowledge that is being absorbed. That's number one. And number two, there is the point of concentration and the center of diffusion. And what he means by that is that in this hierarchy of medical knowledge, the doctors and the people above that, the specialists, the technocrats, they're all bringing in everything, both the observation point and the reaction point to the people in one point, you see. So all this, they are completely spread out, that's true. But it's also extremely tight. When you need to find out about disease, especially an epidemic disease, it's the doctors on the ground who do the observations and note things down and take note of who has been affected by the disease, right? They're the ones who form the basis of the statistics, the observation. But at the same time, they're the ones who also take the information coming from above, the guidance of the technocrats, about whether a disease is dangerous, how to react to it, how to deal with it, whether to quarantine. They take that information from above, from the various technocrats at the international, national, regional levels. That comes down to the doctors, who then pass that on to the population or to the political leaders or whatever, the social leaders in whatever region. This is what Foucault is noting here, that there is a very tight, rigid system of control, but at the same time totally open and absorbing information from everywhere, both in time and place. And of course, he's not describing what's happening today. He's talking about something that's been happening for 300 years at least, right? So he says, in that experience, medical space can coincide with social space, or rather, it traverses it and wholly penetrates it. Now, if you have someone who's a doctor in your family, you'll understand his sentence, because a doctor's space, of course, is a human being, and doctors are human beings like anyone else. But when they're dealing with the medical aspect, you'll know this if you've ever had a doctor in your family, and you talk to them of anything else that's going on in life, and they'll just be talking to you like any other person. But if you start to talk to them about disease, you're scared of having a disease, you feel sick or something, they immediately switch. I bet you've had that before, right? They switch to these various questions, these questionnaires in their minds, because that's what their training has done with them. They're able to switch, almost like a parallel world, right? They enter this parallel universe of medical space the moment they put on their hat as a doctor. Even if they're a familiar person to you, the mind switches for them, and they suddenly become a doctor. Okay, and actually it switches for you as well, because you suddenly become a patient. And that's what he's talking about here, right? That medical space has a special type of sovereignty in which it can totally penetrate in society without having any... In a way, what Foucault is mentioning here is that there is a kind of a dangerous innocence to this, right? Think about this. If a political leader was coming in and saying, open up all your various... and of course here we're talking about medical doctors in a biological sense, so if you have a pain, epidemic, etc. But you can also apply this to psychology, right? Open up all of these things that are in your mind to me. Talk to me about anything that you've dreamt of. Talk to me about anything that's on your mind. Or in the case of a doctor, tell me about any problems you have with your body. If it was a political leader in your local town or city, it's very unlikely that you would just feel happy to open up to that, right? But because it's this medical body, sovereign fashion, medical gaze, it has the ability to penetrate social space, individual space as well. So this is what Foucault is saying. One began to conceive, he's talking about in history, over the past 300 years, 400 years, one began to conceive of a generalized presence of doctors whose intersecting gazes form a network and exercise at every point in space and at every moment in time a constant, mobile, differentiated supervision. It's no longer, again, these visitations from above, this, the plague has hurt us because God is punishing us, etc. It now becomes a kind of constant battle in which these soldiers, these doctors, are enlisted, almost like in a military system, right? Of course, it's very innocent. You don't go to your doctor and feel that you're entering a military barracks, which you don't, of course. In the social space, the doctor is a friendly person who's just discussing things with you. But in the medical space, when he's putting on his medical hat, when he or she is putting on his medical hat, that is now a different space, right? That is now a place where he takes the statistics, he observes, and he's trying to give these invisible enemies, these diseases, epidemic or not, a solid form, right? And that therefore becomes an endless task. This is what Foucault is getting at. There is no end to fighting the disease. So he adds here, talking about the epidemic in particular, Foucault says, whether contagious or not, an epidemic has a sort of historical individuality, hence the need to employ a complex method of observation when dealing with it. Being a collective phenomenon, it requires a multiple gaze, a unique process. It must be described in terms of its special, accidental, unexpected qualities. The event must be described in detail, but it must also be described in accordance with the coherence implied by multi-perception. Being an imprecise form of knowledge, insecurely based while ever partial, incapable of exceeding of itself to the essential or fundamental, it finds its own range only in the cross-checking of viewpoints, in repeated, corrected information, which finally circumscribes where the gazes meet the individual, unique nucleus of these collective phenomena. Now, that's a very complicated way of describing how, with an epidemic, you're talking about something which is itself shifting, right? An epidemic disease it's a living thing, a virus, a bacteria. It's a living thing that's constantly shifting, and the way it impacts the individuals, different groups of people, and also through time, in different periods of time, it's a shifting thing, and therefore it's a constant battleground in which you're trying to find these 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 characteristics which allow you to give that thing, that virus, that bacteria, give it a name, give it a characteristic, so that you can keep catching it. So in a sense, you're trying to catch an invisible thing and give it a existence in the real world, right? And this is the challenge of the medical gaze towards the epidemic. So he adds, at the end of the 18th century, this form of experience was being institutionalized in each subdelegation. He's talking about in France, the 1700s, 1800s, the way the medical gaze, medical professions, medical studies, how these were all organized, right? And he says each subdelegation, a physician, a doctor, and several surgeons were appointed by the intendant, the provincial administrator, to study those epidemics that might break out in their canton, in their region. They were in constant correspondence with the chief physician of the Généralité, which is a treasury subdivision back in the old days in France, concerning both the reigning disease and the medicinal topography of their canton. And when 4 or 5 people succumbed to the same disease, the syndic, the syndicate of the doctors, the kind of the union, the local organizational group of doctors, they had to notify the subdelegate, and he sent the physician, the doctor, to prescribe a treatment to be administered daily by the surgeons. In some more serious cases, the doctor, the physician of the Généralité, the general doctor from Paris, from the center of France, would actually visit the scene of the outbreak himself. Right, lots of details there. It's not something you should worry about, but the point being that you start to have a bureaucracy, a technocracy of the medical gaze, right? 1700s, 1800s. And the idea here is that because you're dealing with this mobile, accidental, special, shifting thing, this epidemic, you need to have that multi-perception, you need to have that constant multiple viewpoints and cross-checking. So it becomes a kind of a war of multiple resources, to the point at which we are today, where it's kind of international organizations and entire nation states mobilizing against these epidemics. And the point here, the essential point you have to remember here, is the why. Why all this is happening is because epidemic and disease is no longer part of the human experience. That's the point, okay? That as we go through the technocracy, as the Enlightenment has had its effect, it has wiped out, or it has tried to wipe out epidemic and disease. And in doing this, it no longer gives the choice to people of disease, epidemics, of a natural life. That is no longer acceptable. So we went from this kind of much more sacrificial approach. Remember with the Buddha's story, the king himself, the ruler, the political ruler, was willing to throw himself and sacrifice himself in the belief that he would heal the sick, right? Even though, of course, this was a belief that had no proof, no evidence. Then we went from that to Shaftesbury and, Plato, Shaftesbury and Bentham, where they were talking about quarantining and controlling the people themselves, because the people are a kind of disease, the multitude and their passions, so controlling them can reduce the spread of diseases, epidemics, including political epidemic of anger, but also medical epidemic. And now we've moved on to the late Enlightenment, 1700s, 1800s, and what we're seeing in the late Enlightenment is a total shift where the disease itself is what has to be wiped. So Foucault adds now, towards the end of his book, The Birth of the Clinic, he says, this structure in which space, language and death are articulated, what is known in fact as the anatomo-clinical method, constitutes the historical condition of a medicine that is given and accepted as positive. Positive here should be taken in the strong sense. So disease breaks away from the metaphysic of evil to which it had been related for centuries, and it finds in the visibility of death the full form in which its contents appear in positive terms. Conceived in relation to nature, disease was then the non-assignable negative of which the causes, forms and manifestations were offered only indirectly and against an ever-receding background. Seen in relation to death, disease becomes exhaustively legible. I know what you're thinking. Didn't understand anything. Okay, let's break it down. What he's saying here is that by turning disease visible, you also turn it into something that is part of our characteristic. So in the philosophical, in the, as he says here, metaphysical, meaning experience of life in general, not just the factual, but just the spiritual, everything philosophical. In that sense, having disease as a part of nature, having disease as something that God sends to punish you, that puts disease away from something inside of you. Okay? When disease becomes visible and part of something inside of you, especially in the case of epidemics, in which you become a carrier of a disease, and not just you, but also things in nature, like other animals, right? Then it becomes, as he says at the end, embodied in the living bodies of individuals. And therefore death becomes part of life and embedded into life, as opposed to something, counter to life, something that is black and white, life and death. Instead, life and death become collapsed into your experience, the experience of individuals. Okay? Now what he's saying, of course, at the end here is that he's not judging whether that's a good thing or bad in terms of, people live longer. Obviously, thanks to this medical clinical method, people are living longer lives, having surgeries. But the point being that the life itself is no longer a life in the full sense of the word. It becomes more of a life becomes a experience which includes death, right, and includes disease, and everyone knows that they'll have a disease of some kind. Right. So just to finish off here, a couple more texts. Here, this text is written by a recent historian, a current contemporary historian who's working in, I think in Scotland, Christos Linteris, and he wrote recently an article, interesting article, talking about two plague outbreaks in China in 1910 and in 1920. And it's interesting because here his idea is that the epidemics became increasingly events. So it goes a little bit further than what Foucault was talking about in terms of the late Enlightenment. The idea that epidemic and disease and this kind of medical technocracy, that this had created a change in the way disease was understood and controlled, and people, populations, politics, social life was being increasingly interfered with or intersecting with the sovereignty of the medical gaze. Right, this was what Foucault was suggesting there. And here also we have an interesting aspect, which is where you're bringing in the media and the kind of information society, which is, that had already begun much earlier. The public sphere in Europe had begun in the 1700s, 1800s, but you really see it kicking off in the 1900s with the birth of the telegraph. Earlier, 50 years earlier, the telegraph, telegrams, telephone, radio later on, and of course we're going into today's world, satellite TV, internet, and so therefore the media has a role in putting pressure on governments and putting pressure on these technocratic medical, group, core of medical specialists in dealing with these epidemics in a very competitive way, in a way that has almost geopolitical aspects to it. So we actually see an interesting case study here, because this is Linteros, his article, talking about the history in Manchuria, which is northern China today, in 1910, 1920. So he writes, plague first made its appearance in North Manchuria on 30th of October 1910 in the border town of Mansuli. By December 1910 it had spread along the newly built railway lines to the cities of Harbin and Changchun, reaching Beijing by the 12th of January 1911 and the provinces of Jilin and Shandong by February. By the time it finally waned, it had killed approximately 60,000 people. The recorded mortality rate amongst humans was 100%, making it one of the most lethal epidemics in recorded human history. As plague spread, the streets of Manchurian cities and towns were filled with people staggering about and collapsing to their death. Scenes of horror were depicted in the international press, which adorned its front pages with the sensational pictures of corpses, death and anarchy. The spread of the plague along Chinese, Russian and Japanese railway lines involved the three empires, which at the time controlled different parts and cities in the region, in a conflict over the explanation and containment of the disease. This conflict took an immediate biopolitical and geopolitical character, since what was at stake was both the definition of the disease at hand and the decision as regards which imperial power was scientific and modern enough to both explain and control the epidemic, an ability readily translatable into a manifest destiny over the control of Manchuria as a whole. So you can see there that the ability of these countries, these imperial powers, and their technocracy core, medical specialists, their ability to control and explain the plague would prove their ability to rule. So it became a very competitive aspect, a competitive event, right? And that's what he's saying here, right? So he says, the first Manchurian plague epidemic functioned as an event, precisely insofar as it instituted a subject of what medical historians of China call hygienic modernity, a subject unthinkable or unintelligible before the particular incident. From an anthropological point of view, what rendered the first Manchurian plague epidemic an event, leading to an epistemological and political paradigm shift, was a void not in the scientific ability to contain the spread of the plague, but in the available categories and classifications of subjectivity in the particular socio-cultural context. Right, what he's saying there is, in previously in Manchuria, in China, northern China, the idea that you could not only fight a plague and reduce the dangers of the plague, but rather politically change the system in order to deal with a plague, with this invisible enemy, that represented hygienic modernity. The fact that you could, for example, implement all these rules about wearing masks and distancing one another and washing. Actually, one of the things he later says in this article is that many of these early rules that were later adopted by international bodies, medical bodies, such rules to deal with plagues were actually first pioneered by some Chinese medical teams in northern Manchuria in 1910 during this first plague epidemic, the first of these Manchurian plagues in 1910. So that this is a very important aspect, and what he goes on to say in the article is the second one in 1920. By that time, many of these previously unknown practices, social, political reordering of life for a certain period of time in order to fight this previously what would have been considered a natural disease, something that you can't really, do anything about. You just put your head down, get on with things, take care of oneself on an individual level. Now, these whole new different techniques to fight this plague, basically had become not only something which was something used for the medical aspect, but also a political and media event. And this was used by the Chinese authorities back then in the press and in domestic propaganda to the Chinese people themselves, as a way of showing that China was a capable modern nation that can handle the plague and can meet the level of modernity, be as modern, as capable as any other country. And that's why he's saying that was a paradigm shift. There was a big shift between what had happened before and what was happening at that point. Later on in the article, Terrace goes on to add what happened after the second Manchurian plague. So if the first Manchurian plague was a paradigm shift because for the first time people were being reorganized, their lives were being reorganized to fight this invisible enemy, the second one was very important because it reorganized the historical view and the understanding of how people saw their own civilization, the Chinese civilization. So he writes, the reason I think it is fruitful to consider the second Manchurian plague, remember that's in 1920, from this perspective, is that it allows us to see how the particular epidemic was experienced as an incident during which what appeared in its truth was not plague as a bacteriological threat, but instead a cultural and political disease acclaimed by the full subject instituted by the event of the first plague outbreak. So what he's saying is, in the first round, plague number 1, 1910, the problem was identified, which was how people were organized. They were spreading the disease, and therefore they needed to be better organized, use of masks, all these technical aspects. But by the time the second plague broke out, the reaction to that was, the problem is not that they're not organized, but it's their mental problem. As he says here, as you can see, the enduring poison of Qing China. The Qing dynasty was the pre-modern dynasty in China, 1800s, before the reforms of modern China. The enduring poison of Qing China, the evil weed of obscurantism and ignorance, constituting the prime enemy of the Chinese race as such, right? So he's saying that the second round of the plague pushes the whole society, including people within the society, let alone the medical doctors or technocrats that Foucault had identified. So you can see here how the plague and the idea of epidemic has shifted from where we started the lecture, has now shifted no longer from being, kind of a natural outbreak or something from God as a punishment, and it's no longer even a job for leaders. You remember Shaftesbury and Bentham, but you have kind of laws and leaders who can organize people, quarantine them. And it's no longer even a question of the technocrats, which are identified by Foucault in the previous text. By this time, you see that it's actually even people themselves, not every member of the society, but a significant portion of them, who are now convinced that the reason why people are dying is because the stupidity, the ignorance, the stubbornness of these traditional people in their society, they themselves are the plague. They are the ones who are spreading it. Not only because they're carrying it's not just that they are literally carrying the disease. Whether or not they're carrying the disease, it's not, as he says here, it's not the question of the bacteriological threat itself, but rather the cultural and political disease, the poison of ignorance and obscurantism. So now let us come to our final text here, which is Gilles Deleuze, and this is a short piece that he wrote discussing postscript on the societies of control. And here it's an interesting distinction that he makes between societies of discipline and that he identifies with Foucault, the text that we had seen earlier. And then he adds that the phenomenon that Foucault was describing, the technocracy, the system of medical gaze, etc., that was more about a society of discipline, in which people are disciplined, literally in the term, just like in a discipline. You go to university, you go to college, university, school, you learn a discipline. So the same way that a doctor learns his discipline, becomes specialized in a specific discipline, then they are disciplined to put on their medical hat, take on the medical gaze. As Foucault was mentioning, the sovereignty, the space, the medical space interfering into the social and political space. Fine, that's the society of discipline. But Deleuze is describing something that is with the media and the developments of the 20th century, in which you have less and less this kind of real world interaction and much more of this mediated interaction. And we already saw the beginnings of that in the previous article. We saw the beginnings of that with the Manchurian plague, right? The two Manchurian plagues, and the way that the media put pressure, geopolitical pressure, on the perception of the plague itself. Well, Deleuze is saying that through the 20th century, going into our century, that has become the more efficient, the more pertinent way to understand epidemics. Alongside, of course, here he's not just talking about epidemics; he's talking about all sorts of things. But in this postscript, I thought it was a good point to end this lecture, because we're seeing the way that it's gone full circle from being a natural phenomenon which you have no control over, into society itself has to control. Not a technocracy, not the leaders, but society itself has to motivate itself as individuals, to control yourself, to quarantine yourself, to isolate yourself, to distance yourself. All these things we're hearing today. To inform yourself through social media, to share memes, to share information through social media, to discuss the virus, to discuss the disease, the epidemic, as though it's a kind of the single most, constructed, the single fundamental fact of life as it is today. It becomes a reorganization of our perspective. And this is all done without any technocracy or leader or particular country pushing this. It's done from a very multiple sources. It's done by people themselves as they react to this. So let's have a look at Deleuze's text just to finish off, and you can make your own mind about what we've examined in this lecture. So Deleuze says Foucault located the disciplinary societies in the 18th and 19th centuries. So remember that's 1700s, 1800s. They reached their height at the outset of the 20th century, 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. These disciplinary societies initiated the organization of vast spaces of enclosure. The individual never ceased to be passing from one closed environment to another, each having its own laws. First you go to the family, then the school, and then you're no longer with your family. Then you go to the barracks and you serve in the military and you're no longer at school. Then you go to the factory, and then from time to time you end up in a hostel, maybe the prison, which was the preeminent instance of the enclosed environment. It's the prison that serves as the analogical model. So then he goes on, he says, Foucault has brilliantly analysed the ideal project of these environments of enclosure, particularly visible within the factory. to concentrate, to distribute in space, to order in time, to compose a productive force within the dimensions of space-time, whose effects will be the greater than the sum of its component forces. So again, he's saying here, of course, the example of the factory is excellent. From 100 people in a factory, right, by organizing them, by taking care of their time, by making sure that they have the technical needs that they require, you allow them to take a set of raw materials, iron, rubber, whatever it is, glass, and you, within a few days, a few weeks, you turn that into a finished car, right? So you have, as he says here, you have created something greater than the sum of its parts, or in this case, component forces, the individuals working in the factory. But what Foucault recognized as well was that the transience of this model. It succeeded the societies of sovereignty. All right, the sovereignty ones were the medieval societies, in which a sovereign, a king, a leader, an emperor was the one who organized life, or in some cases it was religion, the king being, for example, Jesus Christ, the Christian king and Christian sovereignty. And as he notes here, Deleuze notes, these societies of sovereignty had the goal and functions which were different, to tax rather than organize production, and to rule on death rather than administer life. That's an important distinction here when we're talking about epidemics. Remember what Foucault was mentioning about death and disease became part of life, part of the experience of life. The difference between the two were mixed. But in the old medieval societies, whether they were religious or in terms of kings and emperors, etc., the role of the sovereign had to do more with death than with life. How you lived your life was none of the business. But if you decided to be a traitor, then the king would cut your head off, right? If you decided to be a sinner, then you would end up in death, living in the afterlife, in hell. You would be punished by God, right? So it was much less concerned with life and much more concerned with death, because life was something that you owned as yourself. The societies of sovereignty was not just the sovereignty of the church, of the religion, of the kings and emperors. It was also your own sovereignty over your own life. As an individual, you had sovereignty over your own life. You could decide if you wanted to take a risk, if you wanted to do this or that, right? And we saw, of course, the transition. This is what he's mentioning here. The transition took place over time and space. So, of course, with the disciplined society, there was a shift from that, as we saw, towards disciplining. And disciplining included what we saw in previous texts with Shaftesbury, with Bentham, the idea of quarantining, of public offences, that you no longer have sovereignty of yourself, right? And that your life is what matters and what has to be controlled, right? And we saw this, of course, with also the technocratic medical gaze that Foucault outlined. But what Deleuze is suggesting at the end here is that actually in the societies of control, beginning in the 1950s, 1960s, and onwards today, what's sometimes been called the postmodern society, you could also call it Post-Enlightenment society. We're moving towards something very different. So what Deleuze says is, what counts is that we're at the beginning of something. In the prison system, the attempt to find penalties of substitution, at least for petty crimes, and the use of electronic collars that force the convicted person to stay at home during certain hours. For the school system, continuous forms of control, and the effect on the school of perpetual training, the corresponding abandonment of all university research, and the introduction of the corporation at all levels of schooling. For the hospital system, something that's most interesting for us right now, for the hospital system, the new medicine, without doctor or patient, that singles out potential sick people and subjects at risk, which in no way attests to individuation, as they say, but substitutes for the individual or numerical body the code of a dividual material to be controlled. So what Deleuze is really saying there is, all these new programs, all these new technologies, some of which are definitely coming out, that what's called the nanotech, nanomedicine, all these new kind of technologies that are coming out over this century, which are proposing for people to be constantly monitoring themselves, right? So we're already seeing that a little bit with this current situation, the idea of doing testing, etc. But this is really going to roll out over the next decades, and it's all about controlling. And what he says is that the way it's marketed to people, it's all about individuation. So take care of yourself, you're an individual, make sure that you live an individual life and that you are monitoring yourself. But of course the way it really works is through data banks and through individual material, the constant analysis of individuals, meaning you as it's very complicated here. He's saying you as an individual no longer matter. It's more about the statistics. What is your blood rate? What is your pressure? What is your blood sugar level? And you can of course think, and we've had plenty of stories like that, or movies about this kind of dystopian future in which people are controlled even to the level at which they're healthy or not, right? So this is what he's pointing out, that the kind of nightmare of the Enlightenment is that it unleashed this power of observation, research, understanding, which has gone so far that now the individual itself has disappeared, the individual person, and now sickness itself is just a set of data that needs to be dealt with, interpreted, controlled, regardless of what happens for the individual himself or herself, from a human point of view. That doesn't matter anymore. All that matters is the data bank, the statistics. So thank you for listening to this lecture. I hope you've enjoyed it, and take care out there.